In broad strokes, Sri Aurobindo describes for us the conditions and the means for the perfection of the body. Two conditions he highlights. First, an awakening as entire as possible of the body consciousness, and second, a complete education and evocation of its potentialities, again as many-sided as possible. And in this, we come to an interesting aspect of the body consciousness, which has a dual aspect, a kind of an automatism, as he puts it, which is carrying on its work in the physical plane without intervention of the mind. And there is a second kind of automatism which the mind trains, but which the body then continues of its own. Both of these have to be developed, and as long as we are using physical means, he says, whatever we develop, whatever we realize and attain, remains still insecure and bound within limits. Things can come from outside and even from inside, which destabilize what has been achieved, and even what is achieved seems as if not to be able to go beyond certain limits. And that is why he says, to be able to go further, we have to go beyond those limitations. How do we do that? And he reveals the process by a brilliant insight, logic, but also by revealing means by which this freedom from limitations comes. Logically, if the body's training by physical methods keeps it within its own limitations, then we may say that if we bring in other methods, other influences which are less limited than the body, then we would be able to outgrow the body's limitations. And obviously here we find the mind is so much more wide, so much more free, so much more plastic, so much more conscious. And if its influence can be brought into the physical consciousness, and it participates in the training and physical development, then those limits can be freed to a great extent. And still beyond, if we bring in a higher influence than mind, then we can outgrow those limitations and liberate the body consciousness without limits. So he says, the means by which we do this now is to make the consciousness grow in an increasing hold from within or from above on the body and its powers and its more conscious response to the higher parts of our being. And it is how this is to be done is what we are now reading. The body, as it is in its physical consciousness, responds to a certain degree to the life force, the mind, and even to an intuitive influence. But to a certain degree. A large part of it holds within itself below the domain of the influences of these more conscious parts. So what we have to do, he says, the direction in which we have to grow is an increasing hold from above on the body, that is, these higher parts must be able to get a hold on the physical consciousness and its processes, and from within on the body. This implies both the influence of the psychic emerging as well as the influence of mind and intuition descending. And here the link point is the mind and the mental will. It is by an application of the mental will that we are able to infuse the influence of the mind into the body. Then we read this one sentence on which the whole of last time's discussion was based. If the mind can take up and control the instincts and automatisms of the life energy and the subtle physical consciousness and the body, if it can enter into them consciously use, and as we may say, fully mentalize their instinctive or spontaneous action, the perfection of these energies, their action too becomes more conscious, more aware of itself, and more perfect. And here we saw there is so much which is captured in a single sentence. And even after the discussion of last time, we still have more to dwell on. Last time in particular, we read from the mother's guidance on how we can free ourselves from certain tendencies, especially rooted in the physical consciousness. She says, by getting rid of the memory of the body as regards that state, either an illness or even a state, a psychological state, or even a state associated with a moral problem, getting rid of the memory of the body is the way by which we get free of that problem permanently. Here we have a hint which goes into this discussion that finally, whatever happens in the mental, emotional, vital, energetic, and subtle physical layers, finally all of that seeps into, settles in, and finally entrenches itself into the physical consciousness. And even when we are able to get free of those tendencies on those layers, it is this entrenchment in the physical consciousness which is like a seed sprouting again and again, throwing up influences again and again, provoking. And you will recall Mother describing so vividly, a tiny seed pops up, a tiny memory pulling, and the mind turns and says, oh, isn't that how it is? And poop, the whole habit returns, or the whole tendency comes back. But it is here in the physical consciousness that the seed exists. And it is there that we have the most sticky resistance, so to say. And the reason for the stickiness of this resistance in the body is because it is semi-conscious, subconscious, and even unconscious. The secret, therefore, is to draw it out of its condition of unconsciousness and make it more and more conscious. How do we do that? And here we review this sentence now with a greater focus on the details, having seen the overall sense of it last time. If the mind can take up and control the instincts and automatisms. So there are two steps here already. First, mind has to take up the instincts and automatisms. Then it has to control those instincts and automatisms. I'll give an example here of, as a child, I saw a very senior lady, she was then 80, bringing a cup of, having had her cup of tea, she was bringing the cup with the bowl to be placed in the sink for wash. And as she was walking slowly, she needed to hold the wall for keeping her balance, one hand holding the cup and the other hand holding the wall. As she was walking, we heard a rattling sound. And then as she entered the space where we were, we made out that it was the cup which was shaking on the saucer, and because her hand was trembling slightly. And the moment we noticed, and she noticed that we had noticed, she was embarrassed, and she left the other hand and held it to stop that sound. Now that moment was for me an insight which I still remember. First of all, I saw there the instinct within us. When we see a limitation developing, we want to hold it, we want to check it back, we want to free from that limitation. But the other thing was, when one part of the consciousness which was below the domain of her conscious control could not change, another part which was more conscious was brought and the thing checked. Subsequently, we never heard that happen again. Something happened in the physical consciousness, there was a refusal to this tendency, and we never heard that kind of shaking ever again. But here was this very sign, what Sri Aurobindo is speaking of. If the mind can take up the instincts and automatisms, then it can change them. Second, if the mind can take up and control, and this involves a greater entry. First, taking up and putting it in a certain check, but then entering into it and controlling it, changing it, or at least restraining it in a way that it is redirected or given a new form. And the instinct itself, so far, we have left it in a general way. Take up and control the instincts and automatisms of what? And here we saw the three layers last time: the life energy, the subtle physical consciousness, and the body. And we discussed last time how the mind cannot directly control the body. It is through the life energy that it controls first. And through life energy, it is able to access first the subtle physical, and then through the subtle physical, the gross physical. And we saw examples of that last time in great detail, so I won't repeat. But this is the key not only to gaining this taking up movement of the body consciousness, not only of controlling it, but also shaping, changing, and even transforming the body consciousness. I've shared before here something which a friend of mine was able to achieve in his physical training, and I will repeat it here in this context. This is a friend who lives in another city, and having read Sri Aurobindo's descriptions of how the mind should take up the life force and then through the life force, the physical consciousness, he said, why don't I apply this to my bodybuilding program? He used to spend 2 hours a day in the gym doing heavy weight exercises. And at the end of those 2 hours, the result was the muscles swell up from the exercise, and there is this glow that is felt in the body. And the people who come out of that kind of training, you can see their bodies, their muscles swollen up. So he took this as his exercise, and I'm describing in some detail because you will see you can apply it in everything. He would do the same muscle training that he was doing with his weights, except that he put his full mental awareness not on the exercise and the counts, the number of times he does, but on the awareness of life force which is filling. I will briefly digress. This awareness of life force is not merely a feeling you have of life energy, but you can actually extend it into an active sensation of the streaming energy within us. There are certain exercises which come from the martial arts which help to do that in Tai Chi or in Kung Fu, Judo, Karate. You will find when you go deep enough, they have these kinds of visualizations. One such I will share with you, and this is a digression, but it will help to strengthen what we are discussing. One such is an exercise where you ask somebody to pull down your arm, and it's quite easy. You hold it with muscular strength, you tense the arm, and it's easy for someone to pull it down. And then you ask this person, and I've done this as a demonstration in a public space, just calling someone from the audience at random. You ask them to visualize, relax the arm, and then visualize a streaming energy, white light energy, whatever they find easily representative in their image. And they feel, until they begin to feel that streaming energy in their arm flowing out through the whole arm. And at that point, their whole attention is on the energy and not on the muscular effort. And while they're in this state, you ask the same person to pull down the arm, and you find it barely moves. It's almost as if it has become rock solid. And the person who's holding the arm up does not even feel the strain. There is no obvious tension of the muscles. It's so easy, this access to the life force, but it's also so vivid, so intense, so, I will use the word dramatic. But one can go to that extent in the grip of mind on life energy in a specific part of the body or in the totality of the body. It is easier to start in those parts which are more conscious, such as the arms, but eventually one can extend it all over. So it is in this kind of awareness that he would move his arms doing the muscle pumping. But the next step was from that life energy to will a grip into the physical tissue. And it is as if it's not the muscle making the effort, but life energy filling the muscle, which is pulling the arm and doing the exercise. The result was, he said, first of all, he did not feel the strain anymore. The tiredness and strain of the muscles, that vanished. But second, he said, within 20 minutes, he had the same bursting muscles and that glow which he would get after 2 hours of exercise. So he would do this for 20 minutes and he has completed the same result. And then he would just be there, walk around and then walk out. And the others who were doing the exercises could see that he had achieved the same result of 2 hours exercise. And they began to ask him. It was so obvious, the difference. And then he took it a little further and then he showed me this. He gave me this demonstration. He said, now I have perfected it to a point where I can do any posture, any asana, without any weights, without pumping, without repetition. Just one posture, stretched, and with this grip from mind on life force on physical. With this grip, I can have the result of that muscle swelling up of hours of exercise. And he demonstrated to me. He just bent down, stretched his hands like this, held for about a minute, and then relaxed, and you could see the muscle just go like that, blow up. So this is the kind of result that he was able to attain just by this persistence on this key, which Sri Aurobindo is giving us here. But here Sri Aurobindo mentions the subtle physical consciousness. The passage that earlier we have seen also in the Synthesis of Yoga was just mind, life, energy and body. But here he puts in also this intermediate level, because when we are training the body consciousness, it is the subtle physical which is the most plastic part of the physical consciousness. So the mind takes up and controls the instincts and automatisms. So first of life energy, then the subtle physical consciousness, and then the gross body. And at that point, you will find the mental awareness can seep in all the way and even begin to control things which are part of the automatic processes of the body consciousness. Then, a further step. If it can enter into them, consciously use and mentalize. So far, the mind took up, controlled this automatism. Now, a next further step is for mind to enter into that consciousness. And this is something which is much more than what we have last time discussed. In last time we saw, for example, how the mental awareness on the life energies in the stomach could be taken up after food, feeling the energy there, the digestive process, gently invoking or evoking a state of harmony, health, well-being, and then even at some point you can feel the subtle physical, and then one may even develop a sensitivity to what is happening inside in a general way. But at this point, he says, if the mind can enter into them, so the mind enters into the life energy, and then into the subtle physical, and then into the gross physical. Now this entry into, as an experience, it can be at first uncomfortable, disconcerting, because there is a feeling of the mind getting dulled when it settles into a lower grade of awareness. It's akin to, as an analogy, of putting on gloves which are stiff, rigid, hard, insensitive. And then your sensitive hand becomes dulled and coarsened by the resistance of the material it enters in. But just as an example, what you could try as a first experiment is put your mind first in the state of objective awareness, standing back as a mental witness, observing you have a body, you have emotions, you have thoughts, but you are not any of these three. a basic practice. And then observe the emotional being and let your mind consciously as if settle into the emotional being, losing that status. And you'll feel the contrast. There is as if a sense of losing something, of dulling, of becoming as if less aware. But allow it to happen fully first and settle into the emotional identity. You are this emotional person at that point. You are the emotions themselves. And then staying in it for a while, let your mind again drift back in its awareness to that earlier status of observer. You will find inevitably something of that dulling sense pursues you. And it takes a while at first to free yourself from it. But if you do this a few times, you will find you can enter into and free from it without too many side effects. Once you have this capacity, you will find you can enter into the emotional being as if entering a different layer of body, a different layer of substance, and then shape the emotional habits, emotional responses from within. But to be able to do that, you must have attained this status of freedom while in the emotions. Otherwise, you identify with the emotions, you become the emotions, and you are a victim of those very same habits. So, a kind of an exercise like this, entering and liberating several times until you have the full experience and freedom, allows you to then exercise that will onto those parts. Okay, yes. Okay.
I'm getting a bit confused with the different layers.
Okay.
Gross physically, it's understood.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know where to put what I call the pranic body.
Uh-huh.
Is it the subtle physical, or is it one related to the life force? And which one it is, and how to recognize the other one?
Yes. Okay. I'll answer this question as we go along. In fact, as a first step, it is very difficult to become aware of the pure life force as a separate layer. We generally feel the life force in its identification with the body or in its identification with the mind. And its identification with the mind is what produces this layer of the emotional being. So, as a first step, the mind standing back as a pure mental awareness, Manomaya Purusha, entering the emotional being, which is still domain of mind but turned to life force. That's the layer we can access most easily. There you will be touching life energy, but in its association and identification with mind. From there, then you can turn into the energetic movement in the body. And at that point, you will be able to distinguish what is pure energy working in these two layers. But as a first step, it's useful to follow these two separate experiences, which are more easily accessible. For some people, though, it comes spontaneously that they can feel the pure energy separate, but it's not common for everyone. So I'll just describe the same process and maybe it'll become clearer. So, first requirement is you must be able to identify without losing yourself in it. And the practice for that would be to go into and out consciously. A similar process can be done for all other layers, even down to the most gross physical. But that's harder at first. Once you have this capacity to enter the emotional being and emotional awareness, identifying with it and yet maintaining the freedom of the mental awareness in it, then from there you are able to shape and modify its tendencies. The higher guidance, if it comes spontaneously, can lead into this kind of awakening. Generally, what happens though, and this is our normal experience in the sadhana, there is as if a descent from above which fills those parts, clears certain problems, and the problems are gone. Whatever the problems, the inspiration, intuition, or a higher force, grace comes, fills, cleans out, and passes. You are observing as a mental awareness and you say, oh, now it has cleaned out this and I'm so grateful. But you didn't make the effort really. You called at best, or it happened, and that was all. Here, what we are discussing is how the mind can consciously do it on its own effort. If into that effort the mind is suffused with a higher light, all the easier, all the better. But at the very least, the conscious entry of mind into this domain is necessary. So, entering into that layer, you're able to shape as if you are the way you would free your mind from a certain narrow idea. You shift your mental perspective, you look at things differently. A similar movement takes place in the emotional being. Now you as if rearrange your emotions, set a new perspective within the emotional consciousness, prioritize as if move things around. The experience is literally felt like that. The same thing could be done by another person to you. We discussed that last time a little bit of how an imprint of consciousness can be transmitted to another, and a habit or a state can be projected into another. But the same thing could be done from someone else, which often is the case when we enter in therapy, psychotherapy, or interact with a doctor, or just a friend who has freed himself from that problem is discussing things with you. And there's a point where an identification takes place where the person who is more free is able to as if nudge you to shift your position, and something shifts and click, the problem changes, the knot is freed, or your perspective has changed and you're freed from that old habit. But in this case, the purusha, the focal point of awareness changing, is outside you, it's in the other person. It is something similar which happens under hypnosis, where someone else's will enters, projects itself into you and pushes things around. As such, it is useful to a point, but it does not liberate your own consciousness, because the layer which has been changed remains still closed to your own self-awareness. Whereas this process is one where you consciously enter and you consciously change. And then one can bring in a further dimension into it. I can make an effort through my mental will to shape, rearrange, shift my perspective. Or in that identification, through that state, turn my mind, my awareness, and that whole layer of awareness up in an aspiration, calling down a higher help. But it's still my awareness now identified in that layer, opening it. And at that point, this, as if a part of this layer which is more conscious, turns up, opens, calls, and when the help comes there, it can spread freely because you are calling in that layer. And this is a very different experience from mind standing back and saying, oh, I have this problem in my emotional being, and invoking a help there. That is good, that is helpful, but it has a limited result because that layer is not calling it. When you are in it and you call from within, then the impact is far greater and can be often transforming to whatever extent the awareness is settled there. As you proceed, the scope of awareness in that layer of the emotional being can also widen until it includes more and more of it. A similar process then would be taken up with the awareness, mental awareness, going still lower down into the subtle physical and eventually into the gross physical, and open, first of all, reshaping from within and opening from within. When we are able to do that, then we can truly say that we are working on the physical consciousness. And that's when you can say, now the body is participating, or that particular layer where you are is now participating in the sadhana consciously. Until then, the leader of the sadhana was still your mental awareness, and the rest of the parts were reflecting or only semi-consciously being dragged along into the larger movement. It's when you are in it and from within can open and call down the help and make the effort to change. Then you can say, now this layer is consciously participating. In this way, one could go down degrees all the way to the most material, and within the most material, again, there are finer gradations where you can have a limb which is felt as a separate consciousness, a specific organ or a part. So, muscular tissue, nervous system, even the bones, and so on, and distinguish between those layers in identification and open from within, invoke and call from within, down to the most material in this way. And already, if one can take it so far, one would find that one has developed a practical control, or at the very least, sensitivity of what is happening in all those layers. Not only distinguishing them, but being sensitive to the needs of those layers, tendencies of things happening before they become problems. And one could, in identification, then modify, shape, or respond appropriately. You can feel, oh, there's something which this part needs, and you do what is needed to correct it. You will find spontaneously, as you approach the physical consciousness in this way, the body tells you what it needs to heal itself. It is felt wordlessly in that layer as a need, as a gentle urge, dumbly felt, dumbly calling. And one has to become very quiet, because the mind identifying can often impose. And one has to become very quiet to allow that consciousness to reflect in the mental what it wants. And if you are, and this is what Mother calls listening to the body. One can do it standing back and just turning to the body consciousness and feeling its urge. But when one enters in this way, one can get very precise guidance. Coming to the specific question earlier about the life force. At this point, if you observe, in the emotional consciousness, which is more part of the mind, or in the physical consciousness where you're feeling, you will notice that there are certain natural urges, impulses, pushes. The part of the physical or mental consciousness which has a spontaneous instinctive push to do something or to react to something. And you will notice that kinetic tendency, the dynamizing tendency, pushing. And there you will distinguish that as the pure energy, life force, vital, as a pure distinct quality. And the push in the mental or the push in the physical is still the same energetic quality. It's just here it's identifying or operating in mind, there it's in the physical. But the impulse is still the same. And if you can then isolate that, the push, what you have touched is the more conscious part of the life force. And there are further layers which one can go into, which are more and more instinctive, but also subconscious. You're not aware of what is pushing or even when it's pushing, but you see it only after the push has happened. In the life force, there is the instinctive knowledge, which has often a very precise impulse for a specific result. And it is through that instinctive knowledge and the habit of automatism in the body that most of our biological development takes place. If you look at the normal process of the life's growth, and I'm speaking not just of the daily process of life sustenance, but even the normal process across a lifetime, you will see at specific ages certain impulses kick in. Sudden spurt of growth, sudden hormonal changes, sudden likes and dislikes, sudden turn to mental awareness. And it's an instinct which kicks in, which pushes our awareness in directions which we would not have chosen, awakens certain sensitivities or needs or desires. And all of this is led by the life force. It's pushing, pulling in the body or in mind even. And it's really the same energy in both. And often when it operates, it works on both. Or from one, it works on the other domain. And all through, the key is held in this impulse of life force. They speak of the biological clock. How does the body know at this particular age to kick in and start making these changes? When, for example, in teenage, we have a spurt of growth and the biological changes which follow. How does the body know you have reached that age? What is keeping time? And actually, although there are physiological processes also, the key is in the life force itself, which holds the memory and the, so to say, roadmap of the curve of life. And that life force is a continuity of the life force you have inherited on a physical level. At least the instinctive knowledge is part of that continuity. And that is why it reflects and repeats rhythms which belong to your parents and ancestors. The turn of life force to a specific impulse, such as emphasizing more body consciousness, emphasizing more emotional consciousness, emphasizing more intellectual, or emphasizing an introversion or emphasizing an extroversion. All of these things which determine the personality and character of a child as he grows up are all held in the life force. If you could tap it there, you could reshape it. The resistance is in the life force bound in the physical consciousness. That's the greatest resistance. Life force in mind by itself does not have so much resistance. You can will a new rhythm, a new shape, but because the same life force is also rooted in the physical, from there it kind of has this elasticity of springing back to its old habit. So when you can tap it all the way to its physical roots, then you can actually reshape your personality in this way. Now, all of this is mind entering into them, entering into life energy, subtle physical consciousness, and body. Entering into them, consciously use. Not only it has entered, but it has consciously now taken up those movements, automatisms, and tendencies, and does it consciously rather than letting it happen mechanically. And of course, imprinting new rhythms. And as we may say, fully mentalize their instinctive or spontaneous action. Now, already at this point, you have mentalized something of that layer of consciousness when mind enters into it and frees itself until your mind can enter without losing itself. At that point, this is possible that you are free while identified because a part of that consciousness has got mentalized. Remember, it is only in the pure self-aware mind that you have this first status of self-aware freedom. It's not a true freedom, but it is a sufficient freedom that you can begin to change yourself. That's happening in the part of mind which says, I am conscious of my own awareness. Something of that now is established in these layers. And there you have then the capacity to become conscious and reshape from a position of freedom. So that's what he is saying. Mentalize their instinctive or spontaneous action. At this point, something else also happens, which is implied but not stated here, which was discussed in passing in the synthesis of yoga. When Sri Aurobindo told us that just as the mind can stand back from its own domain of awareness and its thoughts and become self-aware as the manomaya purusha, the mental witness, a similar experience is possible in the life energies. In the vital consciousness, a part can stand back as the center and purusha of life energies, pranamaya purusha. But it is a status where the life energy itself stands back from its tendencies and habits and can watch as if, and is free as witness. And a similar status can be realized in the physical consciousness, where a part of the physical consciousness stands back and can be free in the Annamaya Purusha, the physical witness. Now, these things Sri Aurobindo did not elaborate upon in the synthesis of yoga because they involved this particular movement of descent into the lower grades of consciousness and the awakening. Now, how this is normally achieved, there are two ways, and they both reflect what we have already discussed so far. One is the mind stays free, it invokes a higher consciousness which percolates into these lower parts and gradually awakens them and makes them more and more conscious. But the mind remains free, those parts gradually become conscious, and it takes time. The other way is this mental awareness enters those layers, establishes this point of freedom, and returns. And as it does this repeatedly, a part of that layer of consciousness organizes itself and discovers its own separate, free witness status. And when you have that, you have the capacity now to reshape the whole of that domain. The capacity. The reshaping may still take time, may still be difficult. But because you have a status that is free witness, you can begin to change your nature from there. So it is here that you get this key for developing those two statuses of freedom also. So mentalize their instinctive or spontaneous action. And as one begins to do this more and more, he says, the perfection of these energies, their action too becomes more conscious and more aware of itself and more perfect. He specifically refers to the perfection of these energies because, after all, even when we are working in the physical consciousness, it is the energy working in it which is driving it. And so, in a sense, one can say all the transformation of our outer nature finally rests on this liberation of the energy on all these levels. At this point, we briefly step back and look at the similarity with the last few chapters of the Synthesis of Yoga, where Sri Aurobindo described how the mind is to be transformed and raised into a supramental consciousness, and the gradations through which, and the processes and stages through which that transformation takes place. And once you understand this, you will see it is a similar thing which happens on these lower levels of consciousness. Except that in the earlier case, in the transformation of the mind opens consciously to the higher and invokes the higher, is elevated by the higher, and gradually then is transformed by the higher. And then there is a complete continuity in the working of the higher, replacing the workings of the lower, and so on. The difference here is, here the mind is higher than these gradations. They are not calling by themselves. The mind infuses itself, imposes itself, enters into and changes. But the process of that transformation of the lower follows exactly the rhythms of the higher. And if you remember those various stages which we have studied in great detail at that time, we can now describe those stages here in this context. And I'll first limit myself to the emotional layer of the mind as distinct from the intellect standing back as Manomaya Purusha. And you notice here first, the mind can turn to those layers as if pull them up, restrain, check. Let's take an example. I may have an emotional response to specific situations. I feel a shrinking, discomfort, dislike, a need to run away from specific kinds of situations. Or it may be the reverse. I feel a need to react, to lose my temper, to push, to agitate, to react or respond in some way as a compulsion, but which is at an emotional level. With my intellect, I know that's not the best response. It does not help. It only postpones the problem, or it only gives free rein to a wrong movement or a situation. All that I know, but here is this tendency which is happening. The mind at this point, free and above, can impose a will, restrain. I feel like running away, but I will stay my ground. I feel an agitation developing in my emotions, but I will consciously relax and will on those parts a quietness. So there is as if an imposition and a kind of a control extending. Once I'm able to do this, I find I can be in that uncomfortable situation and remain unaffected. But the moment I speak, the moment I enter a domain of action, there is as if a release of energy into activity, and that energy sweeps me off. And I start stuttering, stumbling, hesitating. I rush into wrong action. And again, the mind wills, pulls back, restrains, maybe even practices. Next time, I will consciously speak these words and I look into a mirror and speak it out. A common example is when you're doing a program on stage. You can't help it. There is this nervousness which comes when an actual audience is sitting there. So you stand in front of the mirror and practice and all those things. But the idea is you create a rhythm, a habit, and you seep it into that part. So that when you are moving into activity, the habit kicks in and takes over. And so the mind free above is imposing. If now we take up this process, the mind, having created sufficient control, can now enter without losing itself into that layer. I identify myself with this emotional, mental condition. I am this mental being, I feel this agitation, and now with this status of freedom, I restrain from within. And then I feel, and you will find that layer has its own intelligence or sensitivity. It can feel things, it can feel people, it can feel energies of their emotions. And when you're in that layer, you actually find, oh, you have a new way of looking at things. But it's easy to get carried away, and you have to keep this position of witness with a bit of a struggle at first. And then you begin to shape and change and make more conscious, or just remain in that. And I will not act today, I will not speak, I will just invoke from here. Let the divine light settle in me and in this condition and all of us who are seated here. And invoke in this way, in aspiration from this layer. And all this while, what is happening is something of this higher layer of the mental consciousness is infusing into the emotional and changing from within. And that's a transformation. A mentalization, a transformation by mind of the gradations below mind, in exactly the same way as layers above mind would be transforming mind. The processes and stages are exactly the same, only here the starting point is the higher pushing on the lower, whereas in the earlier case of intuitivization, it's the lower opening to the higher which is the starting point. But the stages after that are exactly the same, replicated. In this way, one could gradually take further steps down. Don't be in a rush, do it slowly. But you will already find when you have access to one layer, you have a greater sensitivity to layers below. And at some point, you have a double movement. There is a part in the mental consciousness which is free, which wills on these layers. Another part which also enters and works from within. You can take up for specific practice something like asanas, which you do in a meditative way. And we have discussed this before, but we can repeat in this context. You feel the tissue of the body as you stretch. Feel your mind awareness, feel the life energy, feel the subtle physical, and then the sensation of the gross physical, and holding all this together in whatever blurred way the awareness is mixed in. Turn that awareness up, opening it to the mother's force, opening and giving itself in an aspiration. The leader of the aspiration at first is the mental awareness which is permeating the space. But then if also the mind turns in and allows an infusion of the psychic influence, then eventually at some point you will find the mind steps back and that turn of aspiration in that substance remains. And at first more in the emotional life force part of it, later even in the more physical instinctive parts of it, if you have persisted long enough. The power of repetition helps especially to seep into these more material parts. And when done with regularity in this way, at some point you will find as you begin the asanas, you will feel as if some layer in the physical consciousness opens itself with relief. Now once again that joyous experience of communion with the divine. No words, just the feeling of that memory of having had that experience over a long time. And that's a sign when you know the body itself is now turning and participating and enjoying that relationship. So one can take up such practices where we do not distinguish between the gradations. We try to become aware as far as possible, but then just keep a general blurred awareness opening, involving as much as possible the whole of these layers. And later, automatically, the distinctions become clearer as one proceeds. And one can, of course, pursue this gradual settling layer by layer consciously. Mother had taken this process all the way down. In the transformation, first of all, we understand we can similarly transform by mind, and this is the mentalization process. Subsequently, an intuitive consciousness settling in the mind can follow the lead of the mind which is already settled in these parts. And the intuition can flow in and awaken and transform or enlighten the instinctive movements. That's when you really get free in the instinct, when the intuition comes in. Still, further layers can similarly follow once the way is set. And if the whole consciousness is intuitivized all the way to the physical, then further descent is possible of levels above intuition, including that approaching the over-mental consciousness, because there is a receptive base in the physical. Otherwise, Sri Aurobindo observes, it is very difficult to remain in the over-mental consciousness while being in the body. Otherwise, the nature of the over-mental consciousness, because it is cosmic, just pops you out of the physical consciousness. Oh, you have a body, so somewhere there, it doesn't matter. It's like a little fish swimming inside this little vast ocean. But you are not in the physical consciousness. You tend to drift out spontaneously. It's only when in the physical consciousness the capacity to sustain that has been created that you're able to maintain the full thread, being in the over-mental consciousness and yet aware in the physical and not losing it, not drifting off like a balloon. Yes. In? Yes. Yes. Yes, okay, yes. So the intuitivization all the way to the physical. I'll give an example of some of the forms it can take. Kapali Shastriya was describing how when he was working in the paints section of the ashram in the construction service, he had to mix paints in specific proportions, measuring out exact grammage to get an exact color. But once this intuitivization of the physical consciousness had been established, the hand would pick up the right amount and it knew. The physical consciousness intuitivized knew through the intuition in the physical, the exact thing. And the movement of picking up picked up the exact amount. There was no effort to, is this right, is this not right? That's still a mentalized awareness. But it would just pick up and put, and it knew exactly. And there was this perfect synchronicity of the different movements in the body. So the intuitivization can be taken quite far. Now it can be again to make further gradations. The large movements of the body. First of all, it can be in the static consciousness of the body and then move further into the dynamic consciousness. In the dynamic, it can have movements in the large movements. It can be intuitivized, or the finer movements can get intuitivized in some parts or in the whole of the body. In a skilled musician or a master musician, the fingers have often developed a high degree of intuitivization. Without the person realizing it, the process by which he practices mentalizes those parts naturally, because now the mental awareness is constantly pushing in to make them do things. Once that mentalization has become sufficiently stabilized, his consciousness can now turn to the intuition. And as the intuition flows, it follows the lead of the mentalization and over time suffuses itself into the fingers and intuitivizes the fingers also. And at some point, the musician can have this experience. As the music plays out, his mind stands back and listens as a spectator and says, "Wow, this is wonderful." And the fingers are going on, and you can say at that point, the inspiration comes directly into the fingers and writes and plays. In describing Sri Aurobindo's writing of the Arya, Mother uses this description. She says, the mind was absolutely silent, and the inspiration would come straight down into the typewriter. Not even into the fingers, into the typewriter. And the fingers would go like this. Not once did he need to go back to make a correction. And after it was typed out, it would only be proofread for spelling mistakes and things like that. But he didn't need to stop, think ever. The thing would just come through. And remember, in the later part of the Arya, he was writing 6 books parallelly, 1 chapter at a time. Nowhere did he maintain notes. He just asked someone to remind him when it was time to give the manuscripts. And the reminder came, he would sit down, and then the whole thing would come through. I've had occasion to see something similar firsthand in my teacher's writings. When my teacher MP Pandit used to write, he made it a routine every day at a fixed time. He would be doing his writing, and it would be 2 pages exactly, down to the line. It was never finishing too early, never crossing 2 pages. If we try to write a letter, you see often people write a letter, and they finish the page and then they find they need to write more, so they go into the margins, they go into the back, and nothing. It was as if the whole thing was constructed to fit 2 exact pages down to the last line. And he would sit down, and then you would feel this tremendous peace and power just flow down, and then he would go brrrr, and the whole concentration so condensed and concentrated, briefly pausing, and then the fingers would just go, rarely having to go back to insert a word, very rarely, otherwise it would just go on. Entire sentences cast in complex structures often, but just going like that. And it was as if the hand had to keep up with the pace of the inspiration. And I would sometimes have to pass through. Normally we would avoid going in his room when he was doing that. But sometimes I've had occasion to have to go. And I could feel in that atmosphere that my thoughts were an intrusion. There was such a solid peace and silence in that. And even if I had a thought, it was as if out of place. And I would make a conscious effort to silence my mind and then enter that space and finish my work. And even when doing that, it was as if I would pull myself out, and it was a nobody who went in and a nobody which came out, removing the personal intrusion, because I could feel I was intruding in something. And once Panditji commented, he said, Sraddhalu doesn't disturb even with his thoughts. He was conscious of that, what was happening there. It was a remarkable experience to have seen that. One doesn't see such things nowadays easily. But so this was, we were speaking of how the inspiration can come into the intuitivized physical instruments, hands. Eventually then, beyond the intuition and over mental influx, pursuing all the way to the physical, and then a supramental influx following through all the way to the physical, that would be the physical transformation by the supermind. Until then, we might have a mental transformation of the physical consciousness up to a point, precarious though, or further layers coming in one after another. each allowing a greater expansion and freedom of the limitations of the physical consciousness. And it is at the last stage of the supramental that the final freedom of from inconscience is possible in the physical consciousness itself. When the last stage of the supramental enters all the way to the physical, then the physical can get completely freed from the inconscience. Till then, the mind can create a temporary space, intuition can widen, draw out certain possibilities, over mentalization can again give a great wideness and even get the body to participate in the cosmic consciousness experience. But it will still be rooted in inconscience. And that rooting and transformation of inconscience will happen with the highest supramental force now entering this physical consciousness. But it cannot unless the overmind is first established, which cannot unless the intuitivization has been done, which cannot happen until it has been mentalized. And this is what we are discussing. So when we speak of physical transformation, we can even refer to it in degrees by saying a mentalization of the physical consciousness, an intuitivization, and so on. Each layer as if transforming to the extent it can. But the lower layers cannot change too much. They can only widen the space and create the conditions for the higher layers to transform as far as the physical is concerned. But when we look at the emotional consciousness, a lot can happen by just a mentalization. It can experience almost a complete liberation from all the emotional knots and tendencies and habits and be completely recast. You can reshape your whole emotional nature quite rapidly because it's still plastic, it's still belonging to the domain of mind. But the instincts below that will take longer because they are rooted more in the physical. So, this is what he is describing we must do. Consciously mentalize the instinctive and spontaneous action of life energy, subtle physical and physical. But it is necessary for the mind to grow in perfection. And this it can do best when it depends less on the fallible intellect of the physical mind. When it is not limited even by the more orderly and accurate working of the reason and can grow in intuition and acquire a wider, deeper, and closer seeing and the more luminous drive of energy of a higher intuitive will. So far we had been discussing how the mental will is the leader entering all these layers. But now the mind itself having limitations, if we can free the mind from those limitations and allow this intuitive consciousness, then so much more can happen. And rather than the mental will, and intuitive will can lead the way. So, for the mind to depend less on the fallible intellect of physical mind. So what do you do? How do you decide? How do you change certain things? What's the way by which you will train, develop, and so on? So far we have used what the mind knew in its sensory turn. As there is a higher opening to an intuition, you will find when it meets a difficulty or a necessity, it spontaneously reveals what must be done and how. And in the very act of its revealing is also the capacity to do it which flows, felt as an experience. As if you remember something which you knew, as if you had done it before. And it is remembered, felt as an experience which you know, and then you do it by flowing into the experience. And this is the way the intuitive consciousness changes, the intuitive will changes, as opposed to the mental will. And you can see how much easier that can be. And also, going back to the discussion of last time, when somebody else puts the will into you to change something, if he taps into the intuitive consciousness, how much easier, more complete, and more lasting that result also can be. So, from this perspective, briefly again to digress from this, a person with that intuitive consciousness, considering this difficulty in me or in someone else, will feel in the intuitive knowledge what's the right correction to be made, will feel it as a living force of experience, could either transmit it through a sharing of experience through words or silently by as if infusing that experience or that packet of consciousness into the other and make the change. But the power of the intuition is so much greater. He says, even beyond the orderly and accurate working of reason, in the intuition there is first of all a wider seeing. You don't just see this problem, but you see it in the context of everything else. You understand the interconnection between different things. You understand how by doing this, what will happen, what will not happen, and perhaps even sometimes negative consequences of a certain act. So there is a wider seeing, a deeper seeing, because you see the chain of cause and effect more deeply. Oh, this is what I must change. I get angry. But the intuition reveals the anger is a peripheral, superficial phenomenon. Behind that is something else which is the root. And that root may be, in this case, a certain insecurity, or a certain jealousy, or a certain agitation in a layer of energies behind, whatever it is, which is the cause of the anger. And immediately the intuition reveals, oh, that's the symptom. You need to focus more on this, and this is how you will change it. And there's this deeper understanding. And closer seeing also, he uses the word closer, because the mental awareness dealing with something still deals with the problem as other than itself. The intuitive consciousness dealing with it feels it as a part of itself, has a spontaneous identity with the thing that it knows, but also with the thing that it must deal with. So it is a closer and more intimate identity of consciousness which is working. So, acquire a wider, deeper, and closer seeing and the more luminous drive of energy of a higher intuitive will. So there is a clarity, a light, and also the power and the drive of energy which comes, which is free and clear, which comes with the intuition and the intuitive will. This being the further development that one must do with the intuitive influence, and you can see how much more it can bring in. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Right. Yeah. I see. Okay. If somebody else puts that in you, yes. What can happen, going to that example, let's say somebody with that intuitive light at that moment is able to imprint in you a certain click, a certain energy, and it opens. Briefly, you realize, oh, it makes sense. It's so obvious. It's so simple. And click briefly, the whole thing shifts and the change takes place. Now, depending on the issue at hand, the change may last. It happens like a lighting up. One feels it like a lighting up of that part of consciousness. The change may last, but the awareness fades. That momentary lighting up which took place, that doesn't stay. That passes eventually because it was not yours to begin with and your substance was not holding it. The change may last and you are no more conscious of how it changed, but now it has changed and the problem is gone. Or, again, depending on the stickiness of the problem, gradually it begins to return again, the old habit. But because it was someone else's intuitive energy, and you don't have it, or you have not developed the capacity to hold it, it does not stay. Whereas when you do it consciously, when you open consciously, when you invoke consciously, and the intuition comes, then already a condition of readiness was created, and therefore the effect is more lasting, what you receive is more complete, and so on. Mhm. Yes, yes, always. If somebody gives you an answer which comes from an intuition, then something of that intuition will touch you, will evoke that experience or a glimpse of what he sees, depending on one's own receptivity. It will evoke that automatically. In the case of the intuition settling, it's an interesting thing in the particular movement of the yoga. Often we don't have the experience of the higher things directly. There are things which are blocked up and closed in us, and they take time to open. And this is where the role of the guru comes. The guru is able to project into you the experience. And the fact that he has projected it in spite of your incapacity opens up that capacity, creates a familiarity with that experience, creates some space in you now which knows what it is. And although you can't hold it, although it fades, the reference is set. And later you can use that memory to recall, relive, and gradually develop and open to the experience again. That's why the guru makes such a big difference. On one's own, yes, one could still do that. After all, the ultimate guru is the divine himself. But this is the advantage of somebody who has that experience now giving it to you directly. And even it is possible for the guru repeatedly to give that experience until that part of your consciousness which is receiving becomes sufficiently developed from the repeated exposure to the experience that it stays. But it's his will, his effort, which is really pushing it into you. From your side, there is a condition of opening and receptivity, which makes it easier for it to happen. But even without that, something can be implanted, and that's the importance of that. Yes, he can even stabilize it in a part or in the whole, depending on your receptivity and openness. And that's why you will see the way Sri Aurobindo would, what Sri Aurobindo would ask from the disciples was simply this. I've shared with you one incident which I'll repeat. And this was narrated by the sadhak to the ashram's librarian, who narrated it to his assistant, who narrated it to me. But when she narrated it, I could feel the light of the experience, that's really the beauty of it. So this person had come to Sri Aurobindo, one of the now the old sadhaks, asking to be taken as a disciple. So first Sri Aurobindo met him in what is now the stamps room upstairs, above the reception in the ashram, where Sri Aurobindo was staying. He met him there, asked him a few questions about his earlier practice and his experiences. Then he stayed quiet for a while and then said very softly, though there is no formal initiation, you are accepted. Then he walked up to the window and looked out, and then called this sadhak to the window and pointed to some flower pots which had been washed and kept in the sun to dry. He pointed to them and said, you must be like this, remaining open to the higher force. And that was all. Subsequently, of course, the rest followed. But a similar advice is what we find in a narration from a very interesting and beautiful booklet by T.R. Kodandaraman. I forget the title of the booklet. It's a slim booklet describing his experiences as Sri Aurobindo's disciple from 1921 to 1923. And they were staying at that time in what is now known as the guest house. And he said the only instruction Sri Aurobindo had given was throughout the day, they had to remain open to him. And they could do anything else they wanted. Of course, they had to maintain celibacy. That was important, and we will come to that subsequently, why that becomes important. But they could do anything else. They could read, they could play. But in whatever they did, they had to keep that their attention open to Sri Aurobindo constantly in remembrance and openness of consciousness. And then once a day, they would sit with Sri Aurobindo in a collective meditation. And then he describes how over a few days and weeks, things began to happen within him. Experiences gradually began to open. And in a few weeks, he could feel as if his whole consciousness was containing this tremendous light and power. And what he was reading at that point from Sri Aurobindo's writings, Secret of the Veda and others, descriptions of light descending and the Ananda descending and things like that, which earlier were just images, he began to experience those things. And at some point he says he even had experiences of the cosmic consciousness and so many other things. And at some point, he and they, he said, began to think that they had become such great sadhaks, that they were having these grand experiences. And this is all within the first 1 year. And he said, but when the yoga moved to changing the nature, they had the rude shock. They found all their nature was exactly as it was. All its tendencies and habits and problems were exactly as they were. And that's when they hit roadblocks. But the fact that they could so rapidly enter into all these experiences was not the result of their effort. The condition of receptivity and openness being set, the rest was being done by Sri Aurobindo on them. And as easily as he could give the experience, he could also withdraw the experience. I've often wondered, having read that booklet, strangely after 2 years there, he left. He went back and he was married and had a daughter and a lot of things followed. I was wondering, having had all these experiences, how could he even choose to go back? And what happened after he went back? Did he lose all the experiences? Did he have access to them? So I asked one of the sadhikas still who knew him personally, who stayed in the village where he was, and from whom she received Sri Aurobindo's books after he had gone back from the ashram. And she just told me that he was a very good man, very sweet man, but it was not obvious whether he had those experiences anymore. Possibly they didn't stay. Similarly, another case was when someone came to Sri Aurobindo and asked for the experience of mental silence. And Sri Aurobindo told him to simply sit down, sit there, and went on reading the newspaper. And this man sitting after a while felt the silence settle and found he couldn't think anymore. And then he jumped up in panic and shouted, I'm going mad, and ran away. And Sri Aurobindo commented that it was a nature which was not ready for the experience. It was premature. So he would choose. He would accept people only when he found that readiness and the necessary conditions which were required for that, for receiving the experience. But my point in bringing this forward is the same circumstances exist even today. The only difference is that Sri Aurobindo is not in the physical body, he is in his subtle physical. And subsequently, he changed the relationship and put the experiences through the mother's action, not directly. That was the arrangement they made. The mother was the dynamic manifesting aspect, and he then focused on bringing down the supramental as his side of the work, so to say. One consciousness taking these two statuses. And we may again say the mother is in the subtle physical, not in the gross physical, but the same thing remains. If we could keep ourselves in that state of conscious openness to them, in all that we do during the day, we would receive as easily, according to our receptivity, of course, and in the parts which are more receptive. And they would similarly be able to build the experience. The condition still remains that one should not disperse what is received. We'll be discussing that in more detail in the next page, where we will look at the requirements for holding those higher vibrations and energies. So we will come back to the question of how the intuitive consciousness can also project itself, make changes, or even give an experience. But the power of mind to transmit an experience is far weaker, and if I may paraphrase what we have just read, far more narrow, far more shallow, and more distant, as opposed to the intuition's wider, deeper, and closer seeing and more luminous drive of energy. And a similar thing happens when one goes beyond intuition with the opening to the overmental consciousness. Then it is something even more vast. It acquires cosmic character. When Sri Aurobindo was doing these things, he had already established himself not only in the overmental, but in the higher gradations of the overmind, which were in the supramind and overmind, bridging the two. And his mind had already been transformed, his vital had already been transformed, and he was working on the overmentalization of the physical up to 1926. And that was established in 1926. Subsequently, it was the supramentalization of the physical, which was the effort. But before that, already all these gradations had been established in mind and in the vital. So you can see how the whole yoga could be described in terms of these gradations of our lower consciousness being transformed by the gradations of the higher, and successively, sequentially in this way. And one can even use to use a very objective terminology, one can describe the current status of the consciousness by saying, for example, I'm just giving just an example of a doctor's report, so to say, a spiritual doctor's report or description, being this person has developed an opening to the higher mind with a few influxes of the intuitive as preliminary opening in the intuition and inspiration, not yet the revelatory power. He has had brief glimpses of the illumined mind, but cannot hold them yet. The vital has opened to the mother's force. It is still in a preparatory stage where parts of it have got mentalized, and reflections of the intuition can now settle in it. The physical consciousness is still dull in these parts, and in those parts it is more open. You can describe in terms of gradations of the higher consciousness in relation to the gradations of the lower. And that's like a map of where one is. In a sense, of course, there are always further refinements of the static and dynamic parts of the consciousness, faculties, functions, and powers of consciousness to the extent they are transformed. But one could literally take it up in this way, with the kind of detailed analysis that Sri Aurobindo provides us of all these gradations. But even without having read any of those things and without having this terminology, this is the beauty of it. When the intuition descends into the mind, vital, and even the physical, it automatically separates and distinguishes these gradations. And that's why this intuitivization is so important. And coming to your earlier question about distinguishing the layer which is the pure vital energy, as the intuitivization of the mind develops and the mind enters these parts, the intuitive influence in the mind will instantly just sift out where there's a mixture, because there's always a mixture with the vital energy. It'll sift out the layers and show you, this is the pure vital as it mixes into the mind, or as it mixes into the subtle physical or the gross physical. And the intuition automatically illuminates and distinguishes, separates those parts, and shows you what needs to be done. And if nothing else, it shows you that you need to bring in a calm and stable peace in those parts, and then the rest will follow, and the higher force will do the rest. So the yoga actually becomes quite simple once that influence begins to come in. And then if there is also a psychic preparation and opening to that influence, then even the process of stabilizing the experiences becomes easier. So then we continue with the text. Even within the limits of its present evolution, it is difficult to measure the degree to which the mind is able to extend its control or its use of the body's powers and capacities. The present evolution, as we are with our mental awareness and with the capacities available through physical capacity of training. And when the mind rises to higher powers still and pushes back its human boundaries, it becomes impossible to fix any limits. Even in certain realizations, an intervention by the will in the automatic working of the bodily organs seems to become possible. Now, when Sri Aurobindo says seems to become possible, it means in his own consciousness he has that already and as a stable realization. So, in certain realizations, an intervention by the will in the automatic working of the bodily organs seems to become possible. So, the will automatically works to set right or to guide even the normal functions of the organs of the body which are subconscious or unconscious to us. And in one place, Sri Aurobindo writes that at this point the body is so conscious that even if he were to take poison, the body would know how to assimilate it or reject it without being affected by it. So when the intuitivization comes, let's say in the general larger functions, like I said, the larger movements of the hands, that's different. When it goes into the finer movements, that's different. When it goes into those subconscious layers of the organic working, say, of the stomach, the heart, and so on, then the intuition in the stomach would know how to deal with the food that's coming in. And here something very important happens. You remember that phrase which is sometimes so cryptic and confusing to people. The supermind from above will descend and release the supermind from below, the involved supermind in matter. Well, something like that happens when the intuition settles in the physical consciousness. Remember, in the body as it is the instinct which drives the functions and sustains the body's life. When the intuitive consciousness enters the gross physical, it connects to that instinct, which is nothing but intuition, now subconscious. And that's the intuition from below, which is opened up by the intuition from above, and the two engage, become one. And at that point, the intuition from above can just pour in and shape this whole instinctive working of the body consciousness in its organic functions. You will recall in the synthesis of yoga, Sri Aurobindo distinguishes the instinct from intuition in this way. He says, in the instinct, the impulse of action conceals the knowledge. In the intuition, the knowledge leads, the impulse to action follows. In the instinct, first there is the push. This must be done. The bird goes and picks a twig and ties it in a certain way. How, why, for what reason, what will happen out of it, it doesn't know a thing. The knowledge is concealed inside the urge, the will. Whereas in the revealed intuitive power, first you know, and in the knowing, the right action follows. But this instinct below is nothing but intuition losing itself inside a subconscious layer of awareness. When this intuition now settles through mind into the physical, it links up with its own representative here in the body and awakens it to its own clear, free working. And then the body can be fully intuitivized gradually. In the same way, the over mental consciousness settling will catch the part in the body which is representative of the over mental. And in the same way, the supramental consciousness entering will tap the super mind involved in matter and open and release from there. So now the whole thing becomes clear when we look at it in these secondary layers. Yes.
I tell you something about in the body.
Mm-hmm.
A long time ago, I swim very, very far away now in Jersey. Very, very far. Suddenly, you have a big line with jellyfish. I tell mother, I go very, very, very deep down, but it touch me full
Wow.
my body.
Wow.
I come back, and I entrance immediately in my room, and I sleep. I coach after 1 hour, no black at all in the body.
Wow.
Everything going outside. It's incredible.
Remarkable.
Outside.
Yes, it's remarkable.
It's incredible. Lot of organ touch, black. You go immediately in a center and
Right.
stay 1 week or 3 days.
Yes.
It's very incredible. I sleep. The poison.
You see, when that happened to you, you had the conviction in your consciousness that you could deal with it. That's why you went and did. And intuitively, you knew what had to be done. That's different. But in a normal person, in whom the body consciousness has not been sufficiently awakened, there would be first a reaction of panic, fear, and even the sense of the body being invaded and in danger and so on, and he rushes to the doctor. Correct. Imagine if children were brought up with these values, not only in mind, emotions, life force, in the physical itself, that all can be done with the divine's touch. Imagine if we were brought up like this from childhood. We would spontaneously turn for every difficulty to the divine in this way, with the conviction, the faith in the body, that yes, we will be healed. And we will, of course, be healed when that is there. Mother tried to create this in the ashram. That whole attempt to keep an isolated space in those days, in the 30s, 40s, was precisely to create these new values separate from the old values of the rest of the world. It's after the invasion has come in that we have lost all that. But I'll share with you an incident, an example which comes through two incidents, both of which were narrated to us. One was by a lady who was one of the first children in the ashram. She said, we barely had enough food to eat. It was just a bowl of soup and some bread, and that was our lunch or dinner, because there was not enough money, and this is all they could manage. But she said, we did everything, all activities full of energy, because we were children, we were playing all the time, we would get wet in the rain, we would play in the hot sun, we never fell sick. And then somebody came and said, this is all bad nutrition. You have to give X, Y, Z items, otherwise these children will remain malnourished. And they started introducing various new changes. And after that, she said, we all began to fall ill. I'll give you another incident which will complete this insight. We were told that in the early days of the ashram, the dispensary had one medicine which was called red medicine. Whatever your illness, you went there and the doctor gave you red medicine. And you were cured. Then one day somebody went, of course he came with those values, and declared, this is nonsense, this is not proper medicine, and this should not work. And when this was reported to Sri Aurobindo sent a message saying, now you start giving the regular medicine because the faith is broken. In the collective consciousness, as long as that faith is maintained, and there is the support in the collectivity of that collective faith, then one can have all these, what we would normally call miraculous results. But it's not miraculous, it is so normal for the new consciousness. But when something infects and breaks that faith, then, well, we fall back to the current faith, which is, oh, I must take such and such medicine, then my body will get cured. Okay, if that's the faith, take it. It'll work for you. But to create the faith in the physical consciousness, it's not enough for the mind to have faith. It must seep into all these parts. And we can cultivate the faith in the manner in which we have been studying this now. The mental consciousness or the psychic consciousness infusing into these layers and awakening in them that conviction and faith. It is an innate knowing which has to be awakened. That's the true faith. It's not a belief imposed, but an innate knowing which is revealed. And then, yes, anything is possible. So he says it is even in certain realizations, in an intervention by the will in the automatic workings of the bodily organs seems to become possible. You can will your organs literally to do pretty much whatever it is they have to do. Wherever limitations recede, because what you're doing now is you're putting a light into these layers of consciousness and the darkness is receding. The layers of consciousness which are unconscious are being pushed away. And there's a barrier. The darkness pushes in, the light pushes out and extends its domain. So wherever limitations recede, and in proportion as they recede, the body becomes a more plastic and responsive, and in that measure a more fit and perfect instrument of the action of the spirit. And this is a progressive process. The spirit's action grows and extends its domain, its conquest, so to say, of the physical consciousness. In all effective and expressive activities here in the material world, the cooperation of the two ends of our being is indispensable, the spirit and matter. So this part will be something very important we'll take up next time. How that cooperation has to take place, why it is indispensable. And even he says it is not possible for us to receive a higher intuition unless something in the physical consciousness responds to the higher intuition and participates. And that will open us to a whole new dimension. Just as on this one sentence we spent 2 days, on that next sentence we will spend a little time also. We'll keep that for next time. We can take up any other, yeah? Yes, the question of dispersion and holding, etc., will come as part of that. Yes. Yes. Yes.
When you spoke of being aware of the subtle physical when you're doing asanas, I'm not aware of this. What does it feel like?
Okay. You remember last time we discussed that when you feel the subtle physical, you will generally feel it like an extension beyond the gross physical. As if your awareness is bloated around, like you're wearing thick gloves or like your body is swollen, that kind of feeling. The easiest way to feel that is to relax a part of the body. Start with the hands, just relax the hand, and then with your eyes closed, try to feel the relaxation in the hands and try to feel as if the awareness is gradually swelling up beyond the sharp edges of the body. And after some time, you'll feel as if your hand itself is surrounded, as if you're wearing gloves, something dense. It's easy to get it with the hands. But you feel it. Look, the question here is getting into the awareness of it, not the idea of it. Yes, that's part of the aura. The aura itself involves many layers, the densest of which is the subtle physical. And that extends like a 0.5 centimeter or 1 centimeter beyond the gross physical. And you can feel it as an extension, as if your hand itself is swollen up. Sometimes in meditation, you might feel as if your body is bloated or floating, and that's the subtle body or some part of the subtle physical. But once you are feeling that in one part, you can easily get that awareness in other parts.
The life force you would feel in relation to your breath or as something moving inside?
The life force can be felt in several ways. You could either go from the subtle physical to the energy that you feel in the subtle physical, or you could go through the mind and feel the energy in your mental awareness. You could start with a visualization of a streaming energy, and after some time, you begin to feel it. There are many starting points you could use for that.
Continue on that question. So, like has been taught in some Hatha Yoga practice, feeling our chakra will give feeling to
Mhm.
certain physical.
Yes. When you feel a chakra in the system, you are feeling it in the subtle physical body because the chakra doesn't exist in the gross physical. Uh, Generally, though, in this yoga, we try not to consciously push or change, play with the chakras. What happens as a result of the general purification of consciousness, at some point, some of the chakras automatically come into our awareness. We just become conscious that it's there, and that's fine. But to concentrate on them might sometimes be premature, especially the lower ones. If at all one wants to do it, one keeps it to the upper 2 or 3 at most. Once the descent clears the way, the rest of it also automatically opens up. Just to give an example of one more person whom Sri Aurobindo had accepted as a disciple. And this is again to drive in the point that his physical presence next to you is not necessary. This is a lady who lived in Bengal. She had a child. She had just given birth to a child. She was accepted by Sri Aurobindo through her request by letter. And I've heard this narration from her personally. She would sit there, she would be looking after the child, looking after the house, but the same condition, her consciousness was always dwelling on him and open to him. And she had many beautiful experiences. And at one point, she said she was there rocking the cradle. The child was in the cradle, she was rocking, and her mind dwelling on Sri Aurobindo. And then suddenly, this whole thing lit up inside her. And she was aware of her whole being. Eyes were closed, but she was seeing with the inner sight her whole being. And then she noticed this whole passage of the Kundalini and the Ida and Pingala and the chakras, none of which she knew ever. She just saw all that. And then she wrote a letter to Sri Aurobindo. I had such and such experience. I don't know what this is. And Sri Aurobindo wrote back saying that this is the awareness of the centers. That was it. So it just opened up when the consciousness had been sufficiently readied. And subsequently, things also happened. She had experiences of an ascent of energy in the Kundalini, partially, slowly, no danger, no destabilization, because it is of the process in this yoga. At some point, then, she said, one day she was in this meditation, she found herself pulled out of her body, and Sri Aurobindo, holding her hand, led her, and they landed on a terrace of a building and then went in. And there she saw this beautiful woman. And Sri Aurobindo had her bow to the woman and said, hereafter, Mother will look after your sadhana. And several years later, she came to Pondicherry, and it so happened she was led to the house of which is now the archives. She came into that room and she said, this is familiar. And then she remembered it was the room where she had been brought when she was made to meet the mother. Because in those days, mother was staying in that room. So these were the concrete experiences that they had. Yes.
In days before, I came to Bombay for some business for my visa. I don't remember exactly where. And I was invited by a family who had a girl in Oregon. And I had no idea who they were.
Mm-hmm.
I just got this address that I would be welcome here to stay. And I found the address and I knocked the door. And I said, I'm from Oregon and talked with him. And I was invited to their house. It was amazing. And I stayed there for a few days. And the father had a darshan, physical darshan by Sri Aurobindo.
Mm-hmm.
And at one point, we were sitting down in the evening, and because we didn't know really each other, I was just a guest in their house and had some things to do in Bombay, a city I didn't know about. I was living there and they helped me do. So then he sat down When we entered the darshan room and Sri Aurobindo was sitting in his chair, and it was darshan. And he said, he told to me that he couldn't see Sri Aurobindo. He saw a huge sun there.
Wow.
It was like the physical sun in there.
Wow.
He couldn't see anything. It was like that. And when he was narrating this to me, it was exactly the same I had that same.
Yes. 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 When we hear these narrations, there is something of the experience which gets transmitted. That's why they are so valuable. When this lady narrated to me these stories of her experiences, for no reason at all, she just decided to share them. And then she said, perhaps they will be useful for you someday. Of course, they are useful for all of us. Yeah.
Speaking about experience, you went out of station for a few weeks.
Yes.
And I would like to know if you had the opportunity to meet your group of inter-spiritual
Right.
people.
Right.
Spoke about Korea
Right.
and Denmark.
Yes. Yes. I have of late had occasion to be part of some meetings which is organized by the Global Peace Initiative of Women. This is a very unusual thing. The initiative is of women, and the initiative is based on spiritual principles. The idea is to bring people of a deeper spiritual experience together from different traditions, because it is only on the spiritual basis that all these lineages, religions, cultures, and traditions can find their deeper unity. So it is not an interreligious dialogue where people come and preach their own religion and go away, understanding their differences. But here, people come from a deeper base and connect at the level of a deeper experience. So it's one of the few things which I have found worthwhile to attend, because I grow. I have benefited immensely from these contacts. And that's what I have been going to whenever I have had to go out of station. We had many interesting experiences I could share, but just three which are fresh and recent. One was a meeting we had on the West Coast in the US, where people, maybe about 40 or 50 people, had come together. And over 3 days, there was a kind of a sharing. They set up a theme, and then people share things from their experience or from their tradition. But it's done with a conscious attempt to remain centered inwardly and so on. At the end of that program, the last day, the last session, there were a few people from the Sufi tradition, and they stood up and said, "We have not heard so and so, one Imam Bashar. We have not heard him chant because he has such a beautiful voice." Now, he was invoked only because of his voice, and I've heard him before. I've heard him chant twice before, and he has truly a beautiful voice. But that was all. But this time, suddenly, it was not in the program. He was asked to chant, and he was not ready. And the result, when you're not ready, is you make a special effort to concentrate. And I saw he was making a special effort and concentrating, and then he began to chant some verses from the Quran. And as he was chanting, I had a distinct experience of this scintillating spiritual light which I experience in our tradition. And I felt that light reflecting in the words and scintillating and reflecting as if falling out in the room. It was such a concrete experience throughout the chant. After it finished, I made it a point to share that experience there. And then later, this person came up to me and said, my teacher, that is his Sufi spiritual teacher, used to say that Where is this boy? I want to hear him chant because he brings that higher light. But although I'd heard his beautiful voice earlier, this had not happened earlier because he himself must have been concentrated on his voice. It was a performance. But this time it was not a performance. He was asked to do an invocation and the thing came. And that's when I realized that I experienced that even across these religious traditions and even certain formed and fixed scriptures, although the mind may find limitations in the formulations in the present context, the inspiration behind in its spiritual core, being spiritual, it's the same light. But the layers encrust and hide the light. But there are always people in the tradition which hold that lineage and that light. And that was one of the beautiful experiences I had, especially in relation to Islam, which presently is going through so much turmoil. Another experience was in Japan. It was a peculiar thing. They had Sufis from Pakistan, yogis from India, and organized by Buddhists from Japan. And it was an unusual experience. And it was in Kyoto, where Mother had lived for many years. And I also visited the house, at least from outside, where she stayed. Fortunately, that house is intact, though the other buildings have been demolished. So we had this session going on. Next to me was a Sufi from Pakistan, and he was a scholar. Generally, scholars tend to be locked up in the mind, and I get a little, I lose interest very quickly when they stick to their scholarship. But this man was different, and it's a happy and a rare combination of scholarship and spiritual experience. He was sitting next to me, eyes closed, and some lady from a Sufi tradition was describing certain practices and explaining things. And as I was listening, certain things, of course, were familiar. And then she said something which sounded wrong. It was an intuitive feel. It was not right. I felt she had misunderstood. So I turned to this person, and before I realized what he was doing, I interrupted and said, "Is that correct what she is saying?" And then I realized too late he was concentrating in a kind of meditation with a book in front of him. So he kind of came out of his concentrated state. And then I apologized. He said, no, don't worry. I was concentrating on the mystical verses from the Veda. And this is a Sufi who's going to speak about Sufism, and he has this book in front. Then I looked at what it was. And it was something about the Vedic tradition, which he had been reading and meditating upon those verses. And later on, I found him reciting from some lines from Rumi, from a bhakti tradition of the Sufi order. But as after his recitation, he translated it in English. But as he spoke the words, it was all in a state of deep concentration. I had a distinct experience of resonance of the Upanishadic vibration in the words as he spoke. Now, obviously, not anybody reading it would have the same vibratory power, but because he was concentrating and it came from an experience that he had, those things had that power, and I could feel that resonance, and it was, again, a very concrete experience for me. It broke all my formations as regards current religions. Otherwise, we've been brought up to say, all these religions, we are past the age of religions, they are just shells, and we have to move to the spiritual age and all that stuff. But I realized that there is a living force of spirituality at the heart of all these religions even today. Another example was with someone from the Christian mystical tradition in the US. And I'm not sure if I'm mixing up names, but I think it was Father Thomas Keating. And when he spoke, I could feel the power of his own realization in the words. He spoke nothing special in terms of words, in terms of intellectual content, but the power was there, and it was coming from having lived and experienced those things. And later, we went to his monastery, which was nearby, and I could feel in certain parts in the monastery that there was a certain concentration of all the what shall I use the word, bhakti or concentrated meditation of all these monks for so many years, decades. And there was an imprint which we could feel there. We could feel it was a sacred space. Not everywhere in the monastery, but in those parts. And all of these are what keep these religious traditions alive. Otherwise, they would all have faded out, if not for a few who hold their spiritual truth. Another interesting event was which took place in South Korea. This group, GPIW, it's a group led by women. It's a women's initiative. And one of their very important principles is that it is the age of the divine Shakti to manifest. And women have a special affinity with the divine Shakti, and so they can play a special role. And so everybody involved in organizing the meet in Korea, everyone was feminine, a female, so to say. Even the Korean partners for this group, it was led by a woman. It was supported by a Buddhist tradition where the head is a woman, and so on. So it was quite remarkable to see that. And somebody made this comment, why is it that you call it women's initiative, peace initiative of women? And another person explained that it is initiative of women because the men so far had their way for a few thousand years, and look at the mess they've made. So now perhaps it's time for the divine Shakti to work through her instruments. Anyway, so in Korea, South Korea, the organization was for us to go to the middle of the demilitarized zone between North and South. That's a spread of about 30 kilometers extending, which is demilitarized, where earlier a war has taken place. Still, there is firing and some million people have died, I think. And at the heart of it is this peace center. And we were given permission to go there. And we had 30 people representing different traditions, religious, spiritual, and others from all over the world. And all these traditions coming together, walking into this hall and opening out through glass to the demilitarized zone. We were asked to do a prayer, each in our own tradition, for a prayer for peace and a reunification. And I thought, and the mic was set so that one person would go and face the audience. But the first person who went ended up facing the demilitarized zone and towards North Korea. And as a result, everybody went and faced that way with their back to the audience and prayer. I think that was fortuitous because it was as if everybody was participating in that turn towards the north. Each one did the prayer in their traditions. I did an invocation from the Veda and then read from Savitri. And I felt something very powerful building up as each person brought in their energy. Until at the end one could feel that here was a container of a spiritual power. And the last thing was a group of Buddhist monks and nuns from a monastery did a Buddhist sacred dance of invocation to the Dakinis, the female goddesses, which they only do in their monastery in private. And it was the first time they did it in public and in the heart of this demilitarized zone. And somebody who was with us, who has this occasional clairvoyant sight, she said she saw the Dakinis being released into this space of the demilitarized zone. I came away feeling distinctly that within 6 months, things would shake up between North and South Korea. As it turned out, within a week, North Korea took up a posture of aggression and did some bombing and shelling and threatened war and things like that. This was all last year, November, if you remember. But obviously something had been shaken up, and the other side, which is holding its separateness, felt threatened and needed to consolidate fear and hatred. Otherwise it would lose itself. But something, I'm sure, will happen and many things will unfold. But this is the kind of work which this group has been doing in different hotspots on earth. And they had even planned a program in Syria which had to be cancelled because of this uprising which started. But it's been an interesting experience for me in the way it opened me to understanding and experiencing the spiritual core of so many traditions. I've also had equally the other experience of feeling how hollow certain lineages, or at least their representatives, were. But I think the more valuable thing is when it is this living power of the Spirit and you experience it as one. They use this word, not this group, but some of the participants from the US used the word interspiritual meeting. And I took exception to that. I said, please don't do that. Earlier you had interreligious, which was fine. But the step above is spiritual, because spirit is one. If you start saying interspiritual, then you're again fragmenting the spirit into so many pieces, and then you'll need another word. And it's just a trying to, change your vocabulary for novelty. Please don't damage this word, spiritual. Keep it for its unity that it represents. So somebody came across saying that this word was coined by one American, American monk, to describe what happens when people come from a spiritual experience within their traditions and then try to find a vocabulary where they can share their spiritual experience. That they call interspiritual. So I said, okay, if you keep it at that level of definition, I will accept the word. But let's keep in mind that the spirit of which these words seek to express is one, and it's not two. So that is just one aside which I thought I would share. Perhaps someday, if they hold a meeting in Auroville, it might be worth it. They had, in fact, originally wanted the Sufi Yogi dialogue to be in Auroville. And somehow it couldn't work out, so they had it in a different place. We had Sufis from Afghanistan who came to Rishikesh in this dialogue. They went to the Ganga and wept because they were seeing the Ganga for the first time in their lives. And in Rishikesh, they went into the cave of Vasishtha. And outside there was the chant of Ramayana going on. These Sufis sat inside the cave and they were so overwhelmed by the presence, they spontaneously began to chant from the Quran. And simultaneously there was this chant of Quran and Ramayana going on at the same time. Unusual experience, but there was no disharmony or conflict. It was just a joyous connection on a deeper level. And then one experience was when a group of these Sufis from Afghanistan, they met the representative of the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, the Karmapa. And the Afghan representative, a lady, she apologized for the destruction of the Bamiyan Buddhas and invited the Karmapa to come there and perform a ceremony. And the Karmapa said, with great stately generosity, he said, let the breaking of the Bamiyan Buddhas represent the breaking of the walls of separation between us. And he said, if I can, if the government allows, I'll be happy to come to Afghanistan and do a prayer there. So perhaps this is something to happen for the future. We'll end with concentration. Yes, yes. Interesting things happening quietly in small pockets. Yes, yes. Yes, all over the world. Oh.